Welcome to Truth Behind History. Today we are diving into America's forgotten war on its own people, the Battle of Blair Mountain. Before we zoom into that mountain ridge in West Virginia, we need to step back and look at the larger world that made such a clash thinkable in the first place, because none of this happened in a vacuum. After the Civil War, the United States raced into an era of heavy industry, railroads, and urban growth, and the fuel that powered this new machine was coal, lots of coal, pulled from places most Americans would never see. Investors in distant cities poured capital into the hills of Appalachia because they saw an almost endless supply of energy buried under those forests, and they built mines, rail lines, and tipples that could move that coal out faster than ever. On paper, it looked like a perfect story of progress, but if you scratch the surface you start to notice how uneven the power in this new system really was. In southern West Virginia, local political institutions were weak, underfunded, and often dominated by the very coal operators who had just moved in. County budgets depended on coal taxes, sheriffs depended on coal money, and entire towns depended on coal jobs, which meant that a handful of companies quietly gained influence not only over wages and working conditions, but also over courts, deputies, and local newspapers. Imagine living in a place where your landlord, your boss, and your main source of news are all essentially the same people, and then ask yourself how free you would feel to complain. At the same time, this was not the only part of America where workers and owners were clashing. In Pennsylvania, the Homestead Strike of the 1890s had already shown what happened when steelworkers challenged industrial giants and met private armed guards instead of compromise. In Colorado, the Ludlow Massacre in 1914 revealed how far companies and the state could go to break a strike, with tents burned, families killed, and the public left to argue over whether order had been restored or a crime had been committed. These earlier conflicts sent a clear signal that when labor tried to organize in the new industrial America, it was not just a polite debate about wages, it could become a shooting war. So, as railroads linked the coalfields to national markets, and as coal operators tightened their grip, West Virginia slipped into that same pattern, where industrial power, political authority, and local law enforcement began to blend together. The details of Blair Mountain are still in the future at this point in our story, but the underlying structure is already there. Energy is flowing out of the hills, profits are flowing to corporate offices far away, and risk is being concentrated on the backs of miners and their families who breathe the dust, live near the mines, and have very little say over the rules that govern their lives. If you look at it this way, Reconstruction and industrialization did not simply bring progress, they also built a system where economic dependence and political capture walked hand in hand, and once that system was in place, all it needed was a spark. If you really want to understand why miners eventually picked up rifles and marched across West Virginia, you have to start with the company town, because that is where the system quietly did its work long before the first shot was fired. Picture a valley where the coal company does not just own the mine, it owns the houses, the school, the church building, the doctor's office, the saloon, and the general store, and the company logo might as well be stamped on the front door of your entire life. When you get paid, you often do not receive standard cash that you can spend anywhere. You receive scrip, a kind of private currency issued by the company that is only accepted at the company store. On payday you walk in with your little stack of tokens or paper notes, and you walk out with food, tools, maybe some clothes, and quite often a bill that says you still owe more than you earned. Now think about what that means in simple economic terms. There is one main buyer of labor in town, one main seller of goods, one landlord, and they are all the same entity. That is not a competitive market, that is a closed loop, a monopsony, where the employer can quietly push wages down while keeping prices at the store high, because there are no serious competitors to discipline those choices. If you complain, if you talk to a union organizer, if you threaten to leave for another mine, the company has a whole menu of pressure it can apply. Your rent can go up, your credit at the store can suddenly be cut off, or, in the most direct move of all, you can be fired and evicted from your house in the same day, your family's furniture dumped on the road while armed guards watch. So every trip to the store, every visit to the pay office, is not just about money, it is about control. People living in these towns understood that at a gut level. They might not use technical economic language, but they knew that if the boss could decide both your wages and the price of your bread, your room to negotiate shrank to almost nothing. Over time, this dependence reshaped the culture of the coalfields. Politics tilted toward whoever could promise to keep the mines open and the taxes flowing. Sheriffs learned which side their salary came from, and a quiet message spread through the hills that survival required obedience. Yet beneath that surface, resentment grew. Every unfair deduction, every overcharged sack of flour, Every threat of eviction carved a little deeper groove of anger. The company town was sold to the country as a story of efficiency and modern development, but for many miners it felt like a cage lined with coal dust. Once you see the company town as a system that keeps workers economically trapped, it becomes much easier to understand why, when organizers arrived promising dignity and a fair deal, people were willing to risk almost everything to break the loop. If the company town was the pressure cooker, the events from Matuan to martial law were the moment someone finally turned the heat all the way up and walked away, because by the late 19-teens and early 1920s, miners in southern West Virginia had begun to reach the limit of what they would quietly tolerate. The United Mine Workers of America came into these coalfields with a simple but radical idea for the region, that miners should have a collective voice in setting wages and working conditions, and that contracts should be negotiated rather than imposed. Coal operators did not treat this as a friendly suggestion. In many camps, if you joined the union, you did not just risk an awkward conversation with your boss, you risked losing your job, your house, and your credit at the store in a single sweep. Families who signed union cards were thrown out of company housing and forced into tent colonies along the creeks and roads, flimsy canvas neighborhoods that sent a visible message to everyone else about what happened to those who resisted. To enforce their will, operators hired Baldwin Felts detectives, private gunmen who arrived by train with rifles, machine guns, and eviction orders, and who blended the language of law enforcement with the loyalties of hired security. One town in particular, Matuan, became the flashpoint. There, a pro-union police chief named Sid Hatfield decided he would not simply stand aside while the detectives tossed families into the road, and in May 1920, a confrontation on the main street exploded into a shootout that left several detectives, the town's mayor, and others dead. Newspapers quickly tagged it the Matuan Massacre, but for many miners it looked less like random violence and more like proof that someone in local authority was finally willing to challenge the outside gunman. Hatfield turned overnight into a folk hero of the coalfields, the man who stood up to the detectives, and his acquittal in court made him even more famous. Yet that fame also painted a target on his back. When Baldwin Felts' agents later gunned him down on the steps of a courthouse, in front of his wife, many miners read it as a message that the legal system would not protect them or their champions. Layered on top of this, the state's response to unrest was not to neutralize the private armies of the coal operators, but to declare martial law in certain areas, round up suspected agitators, and pack jails with union supporters. Weapons were confiscated from miners, union meetings were restricted, and military tribunals often leaned heavily against labor organizers. From the miners' perspective, the pattern was hard to miss. When companies used force, it was called maintaining order. When miners tried to organize or defend themselves, it was treated as a threat to the state. This sequence of organizing drives, tent colonies, the Matuan shootout, Hatfield's murder, and one-sided martial law did not instantly cause an uprising, but it planted in thousands of minds a dangerous conclusion, that if the official channels were aligned with the coal interests, then any hope for justice would have to come from a different, much riskier direction. When we arrive at the March on Blair Mountain, we are not watching a random mob form out of thin air, we are watching thousands of people make a grim calculation that the ordinary tools of politics, courts, and petitions have failed them, and that their only remaining leverage is to move together, in person, across the landscape. The immediate trigger is the assassination of Sid Hatfield, the former Matuan police chief who had come to symbolize the idea that local authority could stand up to private gunmen. When he is shot down on a courthouse staircase by Baldwin Felts agents, in broad daylight, many miners read the event not just as a killing, but as a message: if even a lawman with public support can be wiped out with no real consequences, then the rules of the game are rigged beyond repair. In the coal camps and tent colonies, word spreads quickly, carried by whispers, newspapers, and union organizers who frame Hatfield's death as the final straw. Meetings begin in hollows and along creeks. Men who have already lost homes and wages talk quietly about marching into non-union counties like Mingo to free imprisoned miners, challenge local officials, and force the issue of union recognition. What emerges is not a neat, centrally planned operation, but a massive, improvised army of working people. Estimates range from 10,000 to 15,000 miners gathering near places like Lenz Creek, many of them veterans of the First World War who still remember how to handle a rifle, read a map, and follow basic field commands. They come armed, wearing bits of surplus uniforms and, famously, red bandanas around their necks to distinguish themselves, a small splash of color that will later give rise to the word redneck as more than just an insult, but as a badge of identity in this particular struggle. As they begin to move toward Logan County and the mountain ridges that stand between them and Mingo, they are not thinking of themselves as invaders of their own state. In their minds, they are citizens marching to rescue fellow workers from jails, to break the grip of corrupt sheriffs, and to prove that they will no longer accept a system where one side holds all the weapons and all the legal cards. On the other side of those ridges, however, a very different story is taking shape. Sheriff Don Chafin of Logan County, heavily funded by coal operators, has been building a defensive network along Blair Mountain, recruiting thousands of deputies, company men, and volunteers who are armed and dug in along the high ground. For Chafin and his backers, the approaching miners are not desperate citizens but a dangerous armed mob, an insurrection that must be crushed to preserve law and order and the existing economic arrangement. Two narratives now collide in the hills of West Virginia. One side believes it is marching to restore justice and basic rights, the other believes it is defending property and the state itself, and both are carrying rifles. As the miners move closer, singing, swapping stories, and trying to organize themselves into something like coherent units, the air is thick with uncertainty. No one knows exactly how far this confrontation will go, but everyone understands that, after all the years of evictions, blacklists, and killings, something is about to break. When the miners finally come up against the defenses at Blair Mountain, what is really colliding are three overlapping systems of power: the formal state, private capital, and the workers who keep that whole machine running, and the lines between those systems are much blurrier than any civics textbook would suggest. On paper, you might imagine a neat separation where coal companies simply do business, the government neutrally enforces the law, and miners either accept conditions or vote for change, but the reality in these counties is a dense knot of alliances and incentives. Coal operators have spent years funding local campaigns, paying generous fees to sheriffs, and quietly reminding judges, deputies, and politicians that without coal, there is no tax base. When trouble appears, they do not just call the sheriff as a distant neutral authority, they call a friend, an ally whose own position depends on keeping the mines open and labor costs under control. Baldwin Felts detectives are a perfect example of this blur. They are private agents on company payrolls, yet they carry legal eviction papers, operate with the blessing of local courts, and often behave as if they are an extra arm of law enforcement. So when they beat or evict a miner, is that corporate policy or state action, or something in between? From the miner's perspective, it begins to feel like a merged institution where capital and coercion sit at the same table. Then add the formal power of the state on top of this. Governors declare martial law not to remove private armies and restore a neutral ground for negotiation, but primarily to disarm and detain miners, to break strikes, and to silence union leaders, while company guards and paid deputies often continue operating with little interference. The legal framework itself tends to treat property damage and picketing as urgent threats, while downplaying everyday dangers that workers face underground or in the camps, so that dynamite at a mine tipple draws swifter punishment than a roof fall that kills a crew of men. This is where the moral and economic questions start to merge. If one side controls jobs, housing, local law, and the narrative in the newspapers, can the other side really be said to bargain freely? If the same handful of interests effectively choose both the rules and the referees, what does it mean to talk about justice or contract in any deep way? At Blair Mountain, you can see this tangle in the simplest details. The men shooting down from the ridges call themselves deputies and defenders of order, yet their pay envelopes may carry the imprint of coal companies. The men climbing up the slopes call themselves citizens and veterans trying to fix a captured system, yet to state officials they look like rebels against legitimate authority. Neither side is a cartoon. The sheriff is not a simple villain, and the miners are not all saints, but the structure they inhabit rewards some choices and punishes others. When a sheriff knows his re-election depends more on coal operator donations than on the votes of evicted miners sleeping in tents, which side will he naturally favor when the first shot cracks across a ridge? That is the deeper story here. Individuals move through a web of incentives created by law, ownership, and political dependency, and by the time bullets start flying, the outcome is not just about who aims better, it is about which system quietly trained more of the guns in its own direction long before anyone pulled the trigger. If earlier we looked at the company town as a kind of cage, this slide lets us examine the lock on the door, and that lock is the way money itself is structured in these coal camps, because scrip is not just a quirky old-fashioned token, it is a tool that quietly rearranges power. In a normal cash economy, your wages arrive in a form that almost anyone will accept, which means if your boss underpays you or your local store overcharges you, you at least have the theoretical option of walking away and spending your money somewhere else. In a coal company town that runs on scrip, your pay comes in little metal tokens or printed notes that are only truly usable at one place, the company store, which is owned by the same people who sign your paychecks. That instantly turns your wages into something much more fragile. If the company decides to raise prices on flour, boots, or lamp oil, your real income drops, even if the number on your pay stub looks the same. You can complain, but you cannot simply take your business to a competitor because most other merchants will not accept that scrip at full value, if they take it at all. In economic terms, the coal company is not only the main buyer of your labor, it is also the main seller of essentials, and thanks to scrip it has a near monopoly on both sides of that transaction. Imagine a simple example. A miner earns what looks like a decent weekly wage in tokens, but when he reaches the store, he discovers that prices have crept up again. The sack of flour that cost 5 tokens last month now costs 6, the doctor visit that cost 10 now costs 12, and if he asks why, he hears vague talk about shipping costs or shortages. There is no town council meeting where he can challenge this, and no rival store across the street trying to undercut the price. Over time, this repeated pattern functions like a slow internal inflation inside the company town, eating away at living standards while formal wages appear stable. On top of that, the store extends credit, so when his tokens run short, he signs a slip and walks out with food on debt, and the next pay period his wages are already spoken for before he even steps through the door. Add company-owned housing to this picture and the company becomes, in effect, the employer, the landlord, the grocer, and the banker, all rolled into one. From a distance, someone might call that efficient management of a remote region. From inside the system, it feels like a web. Every raise can be offset by a price increase, every attempt to save can be erased by a sudden cut in hours or a doctor bill routed through the store, and every whisper of union organizing can be answered not only with the threat of job loss, but with the very real possibility of being turned out of your house and denied credit overnight. This is why so many miners described the scrip system with language that sounded less like economics and more like imprisonment. They understood that whoever controls the medium you are paid in, and the prices you must pay to survive, does not need to shout in order to dominate. They can simply adjust the numbers on the ledger, and your life adjusts in response. Once you see that, it becomes harder to view the later armed march as a sudden outbreak of chaos, and easier to see it as the eruption of pressure that had been building inside a tightly managed economic system that left almost no peaceful exit. When the shooting finally begins at Blair Mountain, what unfolds is less like a tidy Civil War battle and more like a chaotic collision between an improvised army of workers and a deeply entrenched system determined to prove it still holds the high ground, literally and figuratively. Along the ridges, Sheriff Don Chaffin's forces sit in prepared positions with machine guns, sandbagged nests, and good lines of sight down the slopes, many of them paid by or directly connected to coal operators who have every interest in making this march look like an out-of-control rebellion. Below and along the hillsides, miners move in loose formations, trying to advance through woods and hollows, firing from behind rocks and trees, using the same sort of small unit instincts that many of them honed in the trenches of the First World War. For several days, shots echo across the mountain as both sides trade fire. It is easy, decades later, to treat this as an abstract episode, but if you imagine being there, the details become disturbingly vivid. You hear the rattle of machine guns, the crack of rifles, and the shouts of men who just days earlier were loading coal, now crawling through brush in their work clothes. Casualty estimates vary, but dozens are killed and many more wounded, and the exact numbers are blurred by the chaos and by the later desire of some authorities to minimize the scale of what happened. Then something truly shocking enters the scene. Private planes hired by coal interests and later federal aircraft are used for reconnaissance, and in some cases improvised bombs, including leftover gas and high explosives, are dropped near miners' positions. Think about that for a moment. Within a single generation of the Wright brothers, American planes are flying over American soil, not just carrying mail or passengers, but testing what it means to project force from the sky against a domestic labor uprising. Even if many bombs miss or do relatively limited physical damage, the psychological message is enormous. It says that one side can now call on a level of technology and reach that the other simply cannot match. As the fighting continues and reports of mounting casualties circulate, the governor of West Virginia appeals to President Warren Harding for federal help. Harding responds by sending regular army troops into the region, complete with uniforms, discipline, and a legitimacy that even the most hardened miner hesitates to challenge. When columns of federal soldiers arrive, miners face an impossible choice. They can continue to see themselves as citizens confronting corrupt local power, or they can recast themselves as rebels in open warfare against the United States Army. Many refuse to cross that line. Veterans who once wore that same uniform and fought under that same flag now look at the approaching troops and decide, often with deep bitterness, that they will not fire on them. Slowly, the miners begin to lay down their arms and drift back home or turn themselves in, even as hundreds are arrested and later face charges ranging from murder to treason. On the surface, the message is clear. The coal operators, backed by sheriffs, private detectives, and ultimately federal power, have prevailed. Order, in the official sense, has been restored. Yet beneath that official verdict, another conclusion lingers in the minds of many who were there. They have seen with their own eyes how quickly the machinery of the state can align with the interests of property when a labor revolt grows too large, and how fragile ordinary people become when the sky itself can be turned into a weapon against them. In the immediate aftermath of Blair Mountain, it would be tempting to say the story simply ends with the miners defeated and the companies victorious, but the real consequences are much more complicated and stretch across decades. On the surface, the verdict is straightforward. The march is broken, the miners disperse, and the state charges hundreds of people with serious crimes that include murder and even treason, a word that makes their attempted stand sound less like a labor dispute and more like a rebellion against the nation itself. Many of those cases eventually result in acquittals, in part because it is hard to convince juries that exhausted coal miners who felt cornered by years of abuse are the only villains in the story, yet the legal process itself has a chilling effect. Men who once stood shoulder to shoulder with rifles now have to worry about lawyers, fees, and the risk that any renewed organizing could be used as evidence that they never truly repented. Union membership in the southern West Virginia coalfields collapses. Companies take advantage of the moment to push yellow dog contracts that force workers to swear they will not join a union if they want a job, reinforcing the message that collective action will be punished. Blacklists quietly circulate, making it hard for known leaders to find work anywhere in the region, and many families decide that their best option is simply to leave. For a time, the coal operators appear to have succeeded in locking the old system back into place, this time with an added layer of fear. Yet stories do not only live in courtrooms and company offices, they also live in memory. Reports from the coalfields leak out through journalists, reformers, and church groups who gather testimonies about tent colonies, scrip, evictions, and the strange spectacle of planes dropping bombs over American workers. These accounts do not instantly transform national policy, but they feed into a growing awareness that industrial conflict in the United States is not just about pay scales, it is about lives bent under private governments that operate with public approval. By the time the Great Depression hits and the New Deal government begins to rethink the relationship between labor, capital, and the state, the experiences of workers in places like West Virginia are part of the background conversation. Federal laws that strengthen collective bargaining and limit some anti-union tactics do not arrive as a direct gift to the Blair Mountain veterans, but they grow from the same soil of outrage and recognition. Meanwhile, on the literal landscape, Blair Mountain itself becomes a kind of contested symbol. For years, it is just another ridge in coal country, then activists and historians begin to argue that it should be treated as a historic battlefield, a site where Americans fought not a foreign army but an internal struggle over power and dignity. Coal companies, always hungry for new seams, look at that same mountain and see reserves to be stripped with modern methods. Court cases and permit fights play out over whether the ridge will be blasted and reshaped or preserved as a reminder of what happened there. That ongoing struggle over memory tells us something important. Even when a system wins in the short run, even when it jails its opponents and signs the contracts it wants, it does not fully control how future generations will judge those choices. In that sense, the aftermath of Blair Mountain is not only a story about union density graphs or legal precedents, it is also about how a nation slowly decides whether it will treat an armed march of its own workers as a shame to be buried or a warning to be studied. When we step back from the gunfire and look more closely at who actually lived through this conflict, the picture becomes much richer and more unsettling, because the story of Blair Mountain is not just a clash between abstract forces called labor and capital, it is a human drama filled with people whose names rarely make it into textbooks. In the coalfields, black miners worked alongside white miners and immigrants from places like Italy and Eastern Europe, often doing the same brutal jobs underground while facing extra layers of discrimination above ground. They slept in the same cramped houses, stood in the same lines at the company store, and yet when the history was later written, their faces tended to fade into the background, as if the struggle belonged only to one group. Women, too, were not simply passive bystanders. They were the ones keeping families alive in tent colonies, stretching thin supplies, caring for sick children, and sometimes confronting company men directly when evictions came. Imagine watching strangers throw your furniture into the road while your kids cry, and then being told years later that this was just an economic dispute. Organizers like Mother Jones walked into this world with speeches that blended fiery religious language with sharp political critique, calling miners her boys and daring companies and officials to arrest her if they wanted the conflict to stop. She understood something that many leaders today still wrestle with, which is that people respond not only to charts and statistics, but also to moral arguments about right and wrong. That brings us to the hardest questions this story raises. What counts as violence? Is it only the bullet that hits a man on a ridge, or is it also the eviction that pushes a family into a freezing tent, the wage system that keeps a worker permanently in debt, the blacklist that quietly starves a troublemaker of any chance to earn a living? Who deserves to be called a patriot? Is it the miner who believes he is defending the basic promise of citizenship by marching against corrupt officials, or the deputy who believes he is upholding law and property by firing from a fortified line? And perhaps most importantly, who gets to decide how those labels are applied? Newspapers in coal country often lean toward the companies that bought their advertising and supplied their paper. Politicians told the story from the courthouse steps. Later, school lessons distilled the whole episode into a few lines, if it appeared at all. Over time, that means a handful of institutions end up shaping the official version of events, while the memories of tent colony mothers, black union men, immigrant laborers, and rank-and-file miners survive only in family stories and scattered archives. When we recover those voices and listen carefully, the neat categories begin to wobble. Heroes are not always clean, villains are not always simple, and the line between order and oppression looks much less crisp than official reports suggest. Instead of giving us a tidy moral, Blair Mountain invites us to sit with the discomfort, to ask whose pain counted, whose courage was acknowledged, and whose version of reality was stamped as the truth. When we put all of this together, Blair Mountain stops looking like an isolated outburst in a forgotten corner of West Virginia and starts to feel like a case study in what happens when economic power, political authority, and control over information all drift into the same hands, because in that kind of world the choices of ordinary people shrink long before they even realize it. The company town system showed how controlling wages, housing, and currency could quietly lock workers into a loop where every path led back to the same owner, and the behavior of sheriffs, courts, and private detectives revealed how official law can tilt toward those who finance campaigns and pay the local bills. The miners did not wake up one morning eager to start a war on a mountainside. They were pushed step by step through evictions, blacklists, and one-sided martial law toward the conclusion that marching together with rifles was the only language anyone powerful still seemed willing to hear. At the same time, the response from above, from machine guns on the ridges to bombs from the sky and finally federal troops on the roads, reminded everyone watching that when a system feels threatened, it can suddenly mobilize tools of force that are far beyond anything individuals or small communities can match. Yet even here there is another thread running alongside the violence, a thread of voluntary cooperation and mutual aid. Miners shared food in tent colonies, took in the families of evicted neighbors, joined unions not because anyone forced them at gunpoint, but because they believed that standing together was the only way to reclaim some measure of dignity. You can see two visions of social order in tension here. One vision treats people as units to be managed from the top, kept in line through a mix of economic dependence and legal pressure. The other vision, more fragile but still visible, imagines that free individuals can choose to associate, to bargain, and to build institutions that answer downward to their members rather than upward to distant owners. Blair Mountain does not tell us which vision is absolutely right, but it does invite us to ask hard questions about the systems we live under today. Who really sets the terms of our work? How easy is it to exit a bad deal? What happens when a small group can quietly shape both the market rules and the political referees at the same time? Those questions are not just about coal, they reach into finance, technology, and any place where concentrated power nudges the lives of millions. If you found this story thought-provoking, if you enjoy history that does not just list dates but asks what they mean for power and freedom, make sure to like this video, leave a comment with your thoughts or questions, and subscribe to Truth Behind History. And if you want more deep dives into the hidden battles that shaped our world, explore the other episodes on the channel and keep digging into the past with us.